Welcome to the Innovation Garage at NS2 Labs. Just outside the garage, we have cool tech, open workspaces, and an immersive room that projects 360-degree interactive experiences. Labs is a place we designed to bring people together, to ideate, to innovate, and invest in great ideas. Today, we're pleased and motivated to welcome Palmer Luckey to NS2 Labs. He's an inventor, an innovator, a business leader who has a track record of bringing great ideas to life. Palmer's the founder of Anduril Industries, which is touted by its investors as the one company that is applying meaningful advances in technology to a dangerously stagnated U.S. defense industry. Palmer and Anduril have raised nearly $400 million from investors, valuing his company at $1.9 billion. Prior to taking on the defense industry, Palmer founded Oculus VR, which was acquired by Facebook for $2.3 billion in 2014. Thank you for joining us today, Palmer.
Of course, thank you for having me.
So just to get us started, I recall in an interview that you said after you left Oculus, you considered three complex challenges or focused areas to tackle: private prison reform, petroleum-based products, food products, or national security. You picked national security, which is a gutsy move considering you'd be competing against Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, and in the past you've described all these behemoths as slow. And while they may be slow to produce results, the top 100 global defense companies are pulling in more than $500 billion each year in defense spending. In contrast, you describe Anduril as a defense product company. So I wanted to see if you could talk to us about your approach to doing what these other companies don't do well, or maybe what you offer that nobody else is willing to try.
Well, I think the key difference between us and the major defense contractors, often called the defense primes because they're the prime holders of the contract, the difference between us and the primes is that we are not a defense contractor, we're a defense product company. And the difference between that is that typically a defense contractor will be paid on a cost-plus basis, a cost-plus contract, where they will get paid for their time, their materials, and then a fixed percentage of profit on top of that. Not only does that really limit their margins to a legal maximum of about 10%, often less, it means that they're incentivized by the very nature of the contract to move slower, to hire bigger teams, to build more custom components, use fewer off-the-shelf components. Because the longer they take and the more people they use, the more money they end up making in the end. In contrast, we use our own money to decide what products to build, when the product is done, and then we sell that product to the government. That means that we are incentivized, like most companies in most other industries, to move quickly, to use the fewest number of people possible to get the thing built in the right way in the fastest amount of time. And that naturally incentivizes us to build, I think, the right things. A lot of things we build are things that the government does not even necessarily believe in yet. And so we know that if the major primes if the government doesn't believe in something, the primes are not going to be getting paid to do it. And if they're not getting paid to do it, probably nobody's doing it. So we're able to go into spaces and use artificial intelligence and autonomous systems to build things that the major primes aren't building because the government doesn't believe that they should be spending taxpayer dollars on it yet.
Some have described you as the new generation of Silicon Valley-style defense vendors. You have more than 30 federal contracts with Anduril, over $200 million in value, and you've got customers like the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, the UK Royal Marines, and since I'm a Marine, one of my favorites is the Marine Corps. So on that last example, you had a really fast procurement. I think I read it was $13.5 million sole source agreement with the Marine Corps Installations Command when your company was just 2 years old. As a young defense company, how did you manage to pull off that type of business so quickly?
The reason we got that Marine Corps contract so fast is because we weren't hired by the Marine Corps to go and build something new. They were just procuring something that we had already built in the past for another customer. And instead of going and trying to get the Marine Corps to pay us to redevelop something just for them, we made small tweaks to our platform that was already working and built something that was perfect for what they needed. We have Sentry towers and Lattice deployed all over the world. Basically, our core product is something called Lattice, which is an AI-powered sensor fusion network that can take data from thousands of sources and merge it into a real-time 3D model of everything that's going on in the area you care about. So all the people, all the vehicles, all the animals, all the infrastructure, you know its location at all times. We also build a lot of sensors that feed into Lattice. So Sentry towers, which use radar, thermal vision, visible spectrum imaging to feed Lattice. Dust, which is like a small portable ground sensor, and then several different unmanned aerial systems that feed data into Lattice. And we had already built all these things before the Marine Corps bought them, and I think that's what allowed us to move fast. One of our first customers, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, when I first met with them, they really didn't think we were going to be able to pull off what we were building. But we made it work. We gave them a demo. After a couple months, we had a contract with them to deploy a few towers as a pilot. A few months later, we deployed more towers. And then 24 months after that, we had a federal program of record, the AST program, the Autonomous Surveillance Tower program. That contract's worth over $200 million. And it made us the youngest company to win a federal program of record since the end of the Korean War. And that was only possible because of the model where we didn't wait for the government to fund the R&D. We didn't go through a whole bunch of SBIR grants to try and squeeze a little money out quarter by quarter. You're not going to be able to move fast. If you go through that path, you are not going to get to a program of record in less than 3 years. That's for sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, that you bring up a good point. I worked in the Pentagon for a number of years. My team there and I were constantly frustrated by our inability to get things done. We faced excuses why our ideas couldn't work, and it was basically because of outdated policy, old ways of thinking, or the answer that it's tradition, which is crazy considering the government built amazing things like moon landers and GPS and the internet. And although it continues to move slowly today, there's bright spots out there for government thinking, like the Defense Innovation Unit, Platform One from the Air Force, the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, which I believe you're working on with Project Maven, and other defense labs. I wanted to see, with all this renewed interest, what do you think the future of government innovation looks like? Or maybe a different angle, what should the future of government and defense innovation look like?
I think the government is on a pretty good path right now. I think they recognize the value of small companies that have talent that they just can't get access to any other way. I think that a key thing going forward is going to be using the right metrics to measure success. One thing you'll see in some DoD innovation type programs is bragging about how many companies they've brought on board through a program, or what a high percentage they've had that they've written a check to. And I'm very glad that small companies can get a $50,000 check really easily. But the real metric that matters is how many of those checks convert into real programs that actually get deployed at any meaningful scale where they're actually making a difference. Imagine if you had a venture capital firm where they bragged about how many investments they made and how easy it was for them to write checks. And then you asked them, well, how many of those have turned into real programs? And they said, oh, none. We've never had a single one ever be successful. But we sure wrote a lot of $50,000 checks. You kind of have to measure both sides of the equation as part of your success metric and say, how many of these were successful? How many of these are real? Because that's what the government should want in the end. That's what the taxpayers should want in the end. And investors aren't going to invest in small defense companies if they don't see at least some conversion. If they see an endless parade of 1,000 companies that get a check for $50,000 or even $500,000 and then they never really go anywhere from there, that's not going to encourage them. They have to see multi-million-dollar contracts being awarded to new entrants to the defense industry, or they're not going to want to invest in defense companies.
Yeah, what a novel idea. We actually have to do something with the money, right? So we've talked a lot about the defense industry, though, and that's all how we do stuff with the money, but I thought maybe we could dig a little deeper into the why we're doing this in the first place, right? It's the struggle for world domination, if we could cue the dramatic music, right? The real world power shift continues to exist between US, China, and Russia. And you might find this interesting. The Chinese Defense Ministry stated just last month that it's actually the U.S. that is the fomenter of regional unrest, the violator of international order, and the destroyer of world peace. So I'm thinking maybe the Ministry of Chinese Defense needs to get out a little bit more often. But meanwhile, the future of the Defense Task Force just last week put out an 87-page report that outlined the vulnerabilities in national security for the U.S. They said things like AI and biotech and quantum computing and space and cyber and electronic warfare make traditional battlefields irrelevant. So I thought I might ask you, since you've been a leading voice on the necessity of government and the private sector working together to maintain an edge against our adversaries, this has a whole bunch of issues ranging from ethics of war to business processes to neural links. Are we making progress? How do we overcome these challenges? There's a lot of considerations, and I know you're focused on as defense products, but it's all part of the big machine. So, what's your perspective on that?
We shouldn't only be concerned about China and Russia because advances in these areas may come from places we don't expect. a lot of the advances that we've seen that have been the most cutting edge advances in artificial intelligence, in machine learning, in sensor fusion have come from very small groups of smart people working in universities or working in the private sector, or even just hobbyists working alone in their garage. Actually, when I was at Oculus, our CTO was John Carmack, a legendary game programmer who was basically behind the modern 3D game engine. He was the CTO at Oculus, and he basically quit Oculus to go and try to build general artificial intelligence on his own in his garage. So this is I really do believe that you could have very small groups making big advances that take everyone by surprise, and so we have to expect the unexpected. It may not be Russia or China that suddenly surpasses us. It might be in Iran. It might be in North Korea. It could be just some bad people in a country that we generally think of as good. And we need to be careful, not just what they care about, but how other foreign powers might jump on that and immediately purchase that technology or seize that technology for themselves.
I wanted to see if maybe there's 3 things you could nail that people or the government should do that helps us build that foundation and the pathway to the future. Does it require commercial innovation? Does it require government to invest? Is it a policy problem, a cultural problem, an action problem? Like, where do we start?
Investors have to see the government making new successful defense companies. If an investor only sees further consolidation and all the money going to the big primes, investors aren't going to want to invest in new defense companies. Now, I didn't have to deal with this problem to the same extent because I just sold my last company for a few $1 billion. In fact, so in the venture capital world, a company with a valuation of over $1 billion is called a unicorn. There's only 3 unicorns in the defense space in the last 30 years: Anduril, Palantir, and SpaceX. And all of them were founded by people who had already sold their past company for billions of dollars. That's not a model for success. Investors don't want to invest in companies in the defense space unless they have billionaire founders. So like the Palmer Luckey who built Oculus in the garage is never going to be successful in the defense space right now because he's not able to raise money. And I've seen this over and over where smart people with smart teams and great tech are told by investors that they will only invest in them if they give up on the DoD because they don't believe the DoD can be a real customer. And unfortunately, the DoD kind of has cultivated that reputation. It's not an unfair one. I think it's changing now, but if you look at kind of the last 10 years rather than the last 1 year, they've still got a ways to go. Another thing that the government can do is, I think, make it clear that they are, how do I put this? This is a little spicy, and maybe this is usually not what I talk about, but there's kind of 2 more things. One, the government needs to make it easier to get security clearances. I know groups of people that want to work on national security, and it takes so long to get a security clearance, they could never dream of doing a new startup. It takes longer to get a security clearance than most startups raise in their initial seed funding. That means if you raised money as a new startup and immediately somehow got a sponsor in the government to sponsor your clearance, your company will go out of business before anyone in your company is even allowed to be read into a program that would make you money. And this is another one of those things that just ensures the rich get richer, the big get bigger, and you never have any innovation bubbling up from the very bottom. It's always got to be inside of these larger companies. Again, this is a problem that I didn't have because we had enough money to wait years to get our facilities clearance, years to get some of our key employees cleared, years to recruit people from other major defense companies that already had clearances. Like, I had a lot of unfair advantages, and I'm glad to take advantage of those advantages, but I recognize that most people won't be able to. Very, very recently, in an unprecedented twist, the largest, most successful, most innovative technology companies in the US with a near monopoly on talent in artificial intelligence, sensor fusion, and networking, like the Googles, the Apples, the Facebooks of the world, are refusing to do work with the DoD, and they're buying companies and then prohibiting them from working with the DoD. I had this happen with me with Facebook. When Facebook bought Oculus, we were prohibited from doing work with the United States military. When Boston Dynamics, a robotic company, was purchased by Google, all their defense contracts instantly killed. I have friends at an augmented reality company that was purchased by Apple. Same thing. Apple said, nope, all your contracts are dead, no working with DoD. And the United States has made a lot of compromises over the years with the understanding, kind of the implicit handshake agreement, that when we give R&D tax credits to major corporations, they're going to work with the DoD to help bring those innovations back into national security. That when we license military technology developed by DARPA to these technology companies to use in their networking products. They're not going to silo it away in a product that the DoD's not even allowed to purchase from them. Like, it's been a handshake agreement, and I think that as times have changed, we might need to revisit that and say, hey, this was a handshake agreement. You guys are breaking it. Maybe we need more than a handshake if you're going to be benefiting from military technology and want to refuse to put back in. Now, I'm not saying we should be like China and force our companies to work with the military, but I do think that we should revisit some of the special advantages that we give to our technology companies that were given to them in the first place based on the premise that they would be helping our national security industry.
Well, and you make a good point. I mean, there's technology, there's process, there's policy, but there's the other aspect of this is people. So I thought maybe we'd pivot a little bit to talk about talent, right, and the people that we employ. And so in your case, you left college to pursue your passion of bringing the concept of VR to life. And after all, you had good examples: Gates, Dell, Bezos, Jobs. They all quit school to pursue better options. Even Elon Musk, although he had 2 degrees before he dropped out of his PhD. But we've got Peter Thiel, who's one of your investors in Anduril. He awards applicants for the Thiel Fellowship with $100,000 if they want to build things instead of sitting in a classroom. So do you think that formal higher education degrees are becoming less relevant in the tech economy? Or how does a degree rank for you compared with a talented, eager, non-grad, engineer-minded person who just has a passion that wants to build things?
They're not becoming irrelevant, but they're definitely becoming less relevant. When I hire people, I'm not looking at what their piece of paper is. I look at what they've accomplished, and I particularly look at what they've accomplished outside of what they were required to do to get the grade or required to do to get a salary. I know people who are brilliant and have no degree. I'm not going to talk about myself. I'm pretty decently smart. I don't have a degree. College wasn't for me. I know people who come up through trade schools that are incredibly smart. They're some of the best fabricators and best engineers I know. And then I know other people who do have multiple PhDs, and they're also really smart too. I guess it's going to sound cliche, but I don't really care what the degree is. For some people, going through the process of getting that degree is the right way for them to move forward in their career. But I would never hold it against anyone if they decided they were going to take a different path. I would actually hire high school children if I could. I don't even care if they have a high school diploma, but I've been advised by my attorneys that if you hire children, it could be considered to be contributing to the delinquency of a minor if you get them to drop out of high school. So I always liked Peter's drop out of college fund thing, but I was told that doing the same for high school kids is probably not legal in most states in the United States. But hey, I know kids who are in high school that are smarter than most of the people I work with in Silicon Valley. There's not a ton of them, but they're out there.
Yeah. Well, and we have folks that have gone into the military straight out of high school, and those people we're interested in with our nonprofit. It's called NS2 Serves. We give the opportunity for veterans and Gold Star family members that want to carve a career in technology, right? So what are your thoughts on that group of folks, like veterans or people who are displaced by technology changes or even the pandemic? What should they do to reinvent themselves? Should it be the gig economy? Should it be technology? I know it's person-to-person dependent, but is there an area that you see in the coming years that we really need those folks to focus on what the future holds in store?
Well, the first thing they should do is they should come work for me. About 20% of our company is U.S. service veterans. We hire a lot of these people because they're the people that have been on the front lines. They've seen how the tech works. They've seen how it's broken. And also, when they're interacting with our customers, they're taken seriously because they speak the same language and they actually have credibility. No matter what I do, no matter how many weights I lift, no matter how many books I read, I will always just be that weird computer boy to the people who are out on the front lines. And don't get me wrong, they like that. But in the same way that James Bond looks at Q in a certain way, the military is only ever going to treat me and my engineers in a certain way. And so having people who've really been through it, I think, is key for us to build the right things instead of just building the things that the engineers want to build, which is a trap I never want to fall into as a company. In terms of reinventing yourself, I think that the advice that I've given a lot of people is don't necessarily assume, how do I put this? Usually it's one-on-one, not in a speech, but the point that I've made to people is don't assume that the thing that you have lots of experience in is the thing that you want to put a lot of effort into trying to redo. Like I have people who say, oh, well, I worked in communications and I did a lot building infrastructure and networking and blah, blah, blah. How can I get a job doing networking in the technology industry. And I'll often tell them and challenge them like, hey, is that really the most important thing you learned when you were in the military? Is it really the specifics of networking, or was it leadership skills? Was it planning skills? Was it discipline? Could it be that maybe there's something out there that has nothing to do with networking that takes better advantage of the actual skills you learned rather than the ones that you had on paper? Now, the tricky thing is not all companies are willing to do the research and give everyone a fair shake and understand each service member and what they can bring to the table. But if you can find a company like that, my advice to service members, and people, whether they're planning on going back in or staying out, don't necessarily assume that you have to find something in the private sector that is the closest alignment for the particular occupational specialty you happened to have while you were in the military.
Well, and we talked about service members. We talked about Q. I thought maybe we would get into the cool stuff, right? Innovation, artificial intelligence. I think you've mentioned before that, your job is to turn soldiers into superheroes with the power of machines. What inspired you to innovate Oculus, Rift, Metro, and Anduril? Is there a crossover there? Like, was that the spark for your ability to build superheroes, or is it just a stepping stone?
So the reason that I worked on Oculus was very different from why I worked on Anduril. I was very passionate about virtual reality, but there's really no connection between the reasons I worked on VR and the reasons that I worked on defense. There is actually a historical kind of tie between the two. Back before I did Oculus, and not a ton of people know this, but I worked for about a year in an Army-funded research lab on an Army program called BraveMind, which was used to treat veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder using virtual reality exposure therapy, basically putting vets into simulations of environments that would trigger their PTSD, and then under the guidance of a therapist, they could learn to cope with those symptoms with minimal self-medication or prescription medication. And when I was working on that project, that was kind of where I first started thinking about how technology could make DoD projects better. And I saw a lot of examples of how it didn't go well. I saw some examples of how it did go well. And that stuck with me through my whole time at Oculus. That's why as soon as I got fired from Facebook, I knew that I wanted to work in the national security space. I've been pondering it for quite some time. As far as the tie between the two or a stepping stone, a lot of people, including the media, often ask me about this, and they expect me to have like some philosophical answer, telling them that VR and AI are kind of two sides of the same coin. The reality is that they have almost no relationship to each other whatsoever. The reason that I'm working on AI isn't because I'm particularly smart at it. It isn't because I've been doing it for many years. It's because when we did a first principles analysis of the entire defense landscape and tried to identify where the DoD was doing well, where they were doing poorly, and where they were doing poorly and were unlikely to do better without help, we identified artificial intelligence as a key area. And I know that now today, when you have all these reports coming out saying, every program must be AI ready and that it's, a key part of our mission, this kind of seems obvious. But remember, this company was started more than 3 years ago. And back then, AI was interesting. People in tech were talking about it, but it was actually a pretty novel idea to build a company around AI for the DoD. And so it's been kind of an interesting journey where we started doing this thing that at the time was actually a pretty hard niche to identify. And then all of a sudden, it turns out that everyone all of a sudden agrees. And they're like, oh, well, of course you're doing that. It totally makes sense. But we're only working on it because we thought that was an area that, one, DoD was doing poorly in, and two, that they weren't on a path to do better if we didn't help.
I thought maybe I'd just give you a chance to explain the overview of how platforms like Lattice, hardware like Sentry and Anduril can really turn those warfighters into superheroes.
So the things we're building are not really new ideas. These ideas have been around for a long time, but they've never been really fully realized or built into a single product. So I talked about Lattice earlier, where we're taking all the sensor data and building a model of everything that's going on. What we're really doing is building a parallel version of the world. We've got the real world and then a digital recreation of it running parallel to it that is fed by these thousands or hundreds of thousands of sensors, and that all the people in that all of the US warfighters can access, and that all of our partner forces can access, and that all of the machines can access. You really want this common operating picture between all of your forces, between all of your branches across all domains. I think the newest buzzword now is JADC2, Joint All Domain Command and Control. And being able to build something that can take data and push it out to either an autonomous helicopter drone, a mobile howitzer, a US Navy destroyer, or even a US service member on the front lines wearing an augmented reality heads-up display, all from the same source. It's not a new idea, but it is a new implementation that we've built. And my goal is that you have, on the future battlefield, the machines doing the things that machines are good at. So rote, repetitive tasks that scale to very, very large quantities. And people should be focused on the things that people are good at, making judgment calls, making strategic calls, working together with other people in relatively small groups. People are not very good parallel computers. 1,000 people in a room are pretty bad at making decisions. 12 people in a room can be pretty good at making decisions. And so if we can use machines to turn people into people focused organizations, and to have the machines kind of take care of the second by second grunt work, we can do things that are just impossible to do today.
Yeah, and I imagine I think I read Sentry, it's all completely off the grid, right? That seems to be the Achilles heel. I heard an Air Force leader the other day talking about building more servers and infrastructure and power grids and farms. Well, what if all that goes away? You still need to be able to provide defense. And I would imagine you're building that into the AI system and platform as well.
Well, like what we've talked about is it's a little bit like a starfish. You want to design, I don't know if you're familiar, maybe you know this. If you cut a starfish in half, did you know that it'll actually just go on living as 2 separate starfish?
No, I didn't know that.
Look it up. It's true. In fact, you can cut it up into more pieces and they'll actually grow and work as their own individual starfish. And then the really crazy thing is if you cut apart starfish and then stick them back together, they'll actually grow back together into one starfish. The reason that we think about it this way is because you can't have a centralized point of failure. Let's say that I have 1,000 sentry towers that are out there and 1,000 aircraft. I can't have a single central point where if that gets disrupted, everything breaks. I need to break apart like a starfish. If I cut off all the communications and power from one half of my sentries to another, both sides need to keep operating as their own fully functional systems. And the second that I'm able to reestablish communications, they need to fuse back together into one gigantic organism. And the way that you do this is by making your things infrastructure independent. So like all of our sentry towers are solar powered with battery reserves that allow them to go through days of bad weather or not very good sun. And we do all of the processing of the data out at the edge of the network. So we're not streaming high resolution video back to some central control station. We're not sending it out into the cloud. We're actually processing it locally at the edge of the network and then sending back very, very small quantities of data like the target type, target bearing, the track information. And then if the user wants it, we can send the full video. But architecting systems like this is going to be very, very important because what you don't want to do is build a smarter digital force that is unstoppable until somebody cuts the right wire. You have to build something so that even as you have huge quantities of your network or your hardware taken out, it continues to function at the highest possible level for whatever isolated set of assets you have.
Yeah. Well, aside from that, shifting gears just a little, I wanted to talk a little bit about awards. So you were awarded the American Ingenuity Award by the Smithsonian, and Elon Musk, Tesla, SpaceX got that award as well. There's other innovators, people who inspire. So what drives you to try new ideas, take risks, build new things, keep changing the world? I mean, I know we've talked a lot about defense, but like, what's your inspiration?
So I think that at the core, I feel like I have a lot to do and I have a long time to do it. I'm only 28 years old and I just turned 28, so I was 27 until recently. I had this problem when I started the company where after I got fired by Facebook and was raising money for this company, a lot of prospective investors were kind of worried that if they invested in me, that I would either get distracted by philanthropy or angel investing or religion or vacation. Because that's usually what happens. When someone sells their company for billions of dollars, they tend to slowly drift away from doing real work. And the way that I thought about it at the time is that I need to just pretend I don't have any money and I need to get back to work because I've got a long time to get stuff done. And when I look at the long list of things that I could do that would be impactful in the world, and you mentioned earlier I was looking at a few different things. So I was also looking at private prison reform, also looking at petroleum-based food products as a way to solve the obesity crisis, which is one of the biggest crises facing the American people. And then working in the defense space. And of all the things that I could work on, this is the one that felt like it would actually have the most real world impact. And people in Silicon Valley, they talk about having impact. They talk about making the world a better place. They talk about changing the world. But the reality is, if you follow the money, it's mostly just about selling advertising and selling search results and in pushing more goods onto people, whether they need them or not. Now, I'm a big fan of consumerism. I hope that the US economy keeps growing forever and that everyone consumes more and more forever. But I don't think that you can find long-term fulfillment in that and truly believe that you're changing the world. Whereas I think that if you can build technology that has a measurable number of lives that you've saved, if you can measure the number of conflicts you've deterred, that's really, really powerful. And even if you can't measure all of them, even if some of this is going to be intangible, you can still feel a lot better about that than selling ads or most of the things that people do in the rest of the technology industry.
I appreciate that perspective, because here at NS2, our lab, one of our mottos is to crush complex problems. And we look at that as a way to disrupt the status quo. In government, we want to deliver commercial innovation in a new way, so we started the lab because we think the old way is just that. By the time a system is built by the government, it's way out of date. Just to your point about overclassification, the RFI, RFP model has grown so cumbersome that it costs millions of dollars from the taxpayer just to manage the process before anything's built. So we felt that we need to build products that are created by people with a passion for our country, and they want to fix things. Because we want to create, pay for the development, take the risk, end up with something that can be used, improved, and drive us to the next big thing. So I think there's a lot of parallels with what you've said and what we're trying to do here at Labs.
It sounds like both of us are preaching to our own choir.
That's right. So, but I think you have a much deeper insight, and that's why I thought I'd end with two questions or two perspectives. Can we just come up with two complex problems that the government and industry should try and fix together?
So I think two things that come to mind, and there's so many complex problems that the DoD has, but two that come to mind would, one, be figure out how to have greater transparency into our operations with partner forces. I think right now we do a very good job in the United States military of keeping track of our own people and our own operations. And I think that we do a much worse job of keeping track of partner forces and making sure that they're working effectively, that they're working safely, that we're actually giving them the aid they need at the times they need. And I think that can be a huge force multiplier for the United States. Like when you look at where the best tech goes, it's usually not to our partners that are on the ground in these conflicts. Like, it's kind of one of the last places that it goes. That's where that's where the oldest equipment is still sitting. And if I were in charge, I would probably flip that around a little bit. I'd say those are opportunities to really take new technology that isn't fully proven and get it into the field as quickly as possible. So I'd say helping our partner forces that are actually on the ground with our troops be more effective, integrate better with our own forces, and have accountability and transparency into how they're operating. I think that'd be a really complex challenge to solve. Even to say nothing of the technical challenge, it's a big geopolitical challenge when not every partner is necessarily going to want there to be that transparency. So it's always going to be a little bit of a give and take. The other side of this, I think, is figuring out how to make sure that critical payloads get to space. And right now, when the DoD is launching a critical payload, most of the time it's critical just because it's expensive. It took a lot of money and a lot of time to build some satellite, and we really don't want to have it blow up on the way up. But even so, that's nothing compared to the stakes that we might have in a real conflict. Imagine a conflict in the future where we have to get a communications relay satellite up into space. Imagine a conflict where we have to get a pod of new GPS satellites up into space, or we don't have any navigation over some huge portion of the Earth. Those are going to be truly critical payloads. And the unfortunate reality right now is that because of investments in counter ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile technology by the United States, Russia, and China, is that we kind of operate at the pleasure of our adversaries. If they wanted to knock our orbital launch vehicles out of the sky before they get into orbit, they have that capability. If they want to hit them after they get to orbit, they largely have that capability. So figuring out a way to make sure that critical payloads get to space and make sure they don't get shot down, make sure that they're safe on the way up, and make sure that they're safe as they continue to perform their mission, that's going to be a really big challenge for the U.S. DoD, our Space Force, and a lot of our allies. And it's kind of harder to think of a more complex problem than that, given how many different aspects of our machinery it touches.
Those are some great focus areas. We've had a lot of good discussion. I wanted to thank you for taking the time to visit us here at NS2 Labs, and we're all looking forward to the future of defense and what's next from Palmer Luckey. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This was a blast.